Jerome Mayhew.
Quite right, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that the Carbon Emissions Buildings Bill be now read a second time. This bill creates a mechanism to boost United Kingdom construction whilst driving down our greenhouse gas emissions, key to delivering UK growth in a manner aligned with the country's net zero targets. It's a proposal that has come from the industry and it's wholeheartedly supported by it. They are working to reduce these carbon emissions voluntarily, but need government to take the lead and accelerate their work that they have started. The bill tackles an area of greenhouse gases called embodied carbon. Every year, our buildings and construction are responsible for the emission of over 150 million tonnes of greenhouse gases. That, Madam Deputy Speaker, is fully a quarter of our country's total carbon footprint. Now, 2/3 of those emissions are due to lighting buildings, their power, their water, their heating and cooling, and have the tag of operational carbon. And government has taken bold steps to reduce these emissions as part of our net zero strategy. The building regulations under Part L effectively address the reduction of operational carbon. And as a direct consequence of these regulations, and very importantly, the decarbonisation of the electricity supply, it's anticipated that by 2035, we can expect that the emissions related to the services side, the operational carbon side of buildings and construction, will have fallen to an almost negligible amount. So that's fantastic news, and the government rightly deserves our praise for gripping this and creating a plan, enforcing it through regulation, and then implementing it with the very significant reductions in operational carbon that we are already seeing. But what about the other third of building emissions? Where do these remaining emissions come from? And what plan do we have to deal with them? That other third, Madam Deputy Speaker, comes from our use of construction materials, their production, transportation and installation on our construction sites, then their maintenance, refurbishment and replacement during the building's life, and ultimately their demolition and removal at the end of a building's life. That is 50 million tonnes of carbon emissions each year, and these are called embodied carbon. To put this figure into perspective, that amount is greater than the emissions of all of the United Kingdom's aviation industry and shipping industry combined. And if you think about how much effort we put into the control, the planned reduction of those emissions, then we've got SAR, so the Sustainable Fuels, Aviation Fuels plan. We've got Jet Zero. We've got plans to move to have corridors for emission-free shipping based around ammonia and hydrogen. All these we are taking very seriously, but what are we doing as a government and as a nation to deal with the embodied carbon of construction? At 50 million tonnes per year, you might expect that the government would already have plans to direct the reduction of these emissions in line with our legally binding net zero targets. But the truth is that embodied carbon remains completely unregulated. It shows in the data. Operating carbon emissions are dropping rapidly because of Part L and because of the decarbonisation of our electricity supply. But if you look at the data for embodied carbon, there is no current trend at all towards any reduction. In fact, if you go back to 1995, you'll see that 43 million tonnes of greenhouse gas equivalent emissions were emitted. And in 2018, rather than being any reduction, that number has crept up to 49 million tonnes and approaching 50 million. The Environmental Audit Select Committee, on which I sit, reported on this issue in May. It concluded in its report, which I recommend to the House, that the single most significant policy the government could introduce would be a mandatory requirement to assess embodied carbon in buildings. Because not only do we not regulate its reduction, we currently have no idea how much we're not requiring business constructors to calculate how much their construction or their design is going to emit. Now, to be fair to the government, its net zero strategy does set out its intention to, and I quote, support action in the construction sector by improving reporting on embodied carbon in buildings and infrastructure with a view to exploring a maximum level for new builds in the future. And in a similar vein, the government's construction playbook calls for carbon assessments on all public projects. However, whilst it requires public projects to calculate the carbon, it provides no details as to how they should take place or what an appropriate level of carbon emissions would be. So every school, hospital and road we build is therefore taking a different approach to calculating overall carbon. It's hopelessly inefficient for the industry, and as a result, it actually costs the taxpayer more money. As is so often the case, the real world is moving faster than the pace of the government. Major design firms, those which employ tens of thousands of staff, are making voluntary commitments to calculate the carbon emissions due to their designs. The construction industry, bodies such as the Royal Institute of British Architects, RIBA, has set out voluntary embodied carbon emissions targets. And the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, RICS, has defined a methodology for calculating embodied carbon. But their ambition is hampered by a lack of regulation. The voluntary industry targets remain just that. They're voluntary. Every project they work on has different reporting requirements and different carbon targets. This costs businesses time and money. Regulation is needed to speed up processes by identifying an agreed methodology and to spread acceptable practice throughout the sector, not just the market leaders, but the long tail that any sector has to bring them up to a minimum of best practice. Today, nearly 200 of the country's leading developers, clients, contractors, architects, engineers, and institutions have written statements of support calling for the regulation of embodied carbon. The Royal Institute of British Architects writes that they, and I quote, call on the government to introduce regulations that stipulate consistent assessment and reporting of whole life carbon, including setting specific targets for embodied carbon. One of the leading investors in this sector, NatWest, highlight regulation's role as, quote, one of the key mechanisms that drives sustainable behaviour and action amongst investors, tenants, developers and homeowners. The UK's largest active asset manager, Aberdeen, although that's spelt rather strangely, they say that they, and I quote, believe that the requirements to report whole life carbon and set informed limits on embodied carbon would help the real estate sector to decarbonise. And Barratt Homes, one of the leading Big Four producers of homes in the residential sector, they've said that, quote, they have been calculating the embodied carbon of our homes for over 10 years now, and that they are also developing requirements for their supply chains to support this process. Similar sentiments come from corporate leaders like Land Securities, Landsec, British Land, Lend-Lease, Wilmot Dixon, Sir Robert McAlpine, Lang O'Rourke, Morgan Sindall, ISG, I could go on. And industry bodies like the Construction Industry Council, the Chartered Institute of Building, Timber Development UK, importantly, the Concrete Centre, and equally importantly, the Steel Construction Institute also support this approach. So industry already has the tools necessary to respond to this bill. Regulation would simply unlock the final door to enable existing mechanisms to run smoothly. Well, what are other countries in Europe doing about this? France, Sweden, and the Netherlands already have embodied carbon regulation in force. The Netherlands, the market leader here, they have had this in force since 2012. Finland, Denmark, and Norway are in the process of introducing it, and the European Commission is considering currently proposals to roll out across the whole of the UK. So why aren't we? Despite the government recognising that it needs to act, despite the industry agreeing and setting out a widely supported solution, the government seems to be beset by hesitation. Its response to the Environmental Audit Committee stated that it intends to consult and undertake parallel stakeholder engagement sometime in 2023 on what its approach should be about embodied carbon. And yet this is to a report that was published in May 2022. When the cost of inaction is 50 million tonnes of carbon emissions per year, where is the dynamism of government? Where is its sense of urgency? My bill will enable the government to catch up on this issue, directly amending the building regulations. The amendments will require the reporting of carbon on significant building work, both to new projects and refurbishments from 2023 in the large building non-domestic sector, and by 2025 for housing in developments of more than 10 dwellings. It will then move to introduce limits on the embodied carbon emitted through construction from 2027, something which can be ratcheted down over time in line with our net zero targets. This strategy of report first, limit later, follows the precedents set elsewhere in Europe and makes the transition towards zero carbon construction easier, while sending a clear signal that legislated limits are coming. Similarly, Madam Deputy Speaker, to assist SMEs, the bill only introduces these requirements for major projects, those that are greater than 1,000 square metre of useful internal area, or responsible for the construction of more than 10 new dwellings. A clear policy signal of the direction of travel is what the industry needs to accelerate its development and large-scale use of lower carbon products and using them in more efficient ways, just as the policy statement that vehicles will not be sold with an internal combustion engine post-2030 has transformed the car manufacturing market. It's that kind of market signal that the industry, the construction industry, needs to invest in lower carbon alternatives and take the next step to the wider adoption of what are currently niche products. By sending a clear policy signal from government to industry, we will enable the sector to grow ahead of time. We must signal the roadmap to the end of high carbon construction in the United Kingdom to enable the building industry to take the needed steps towards zero emission construction. Is it really too soon to move, as the government suggests? In its response to the Environmental Audit Committee report, the government identified 3 work streams before it wants to take a decision. The first one is that the government wants to continue understanding the actions that industry are already taking and their impact. It's also watching the outcomes of the Greater London Authority's planning policy requirement quotes with interest, and is looking at international policy examples. Well, I have already demonstrated that my bill is the outcome of industry consensus, and that it follows the report first, limit later approach adopted internationally. So the only additional consideration is an assessment of the use of the planning policy by the Greater London Authority in their London plan to require measurement of embodied carbon as part of the planning process. And yet, even here, there is a consensus that regulation via the building regs is the right approach. During the environmental audit evidence session, the principal strategic planner for the Greater London Authority's London plan was asked in terms what role building regulations could play. Her answer was explicit. She said, "We would agree it is something that the government should regulate. We think it should be part of building regulations." So even the GLA, whose planning policy approach the government apparently sees as a potential alternative to the use of building regulations, agrees that building regulations are the right way to go. And there are, of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, very sound practical reasons for this. Detailed decisions on materials will not have been made at the date of the planning application, so only vague guesstimates of carbon intensity and emissions could be used at that stage. It's at the point of construction that meaningful figures can be generated, and that's where planning control comes in. In any event, you don't expect planning officers to assess the properties of rooftop insulation, for example, as part of your planning application. That kind of technical assessment is the job of building control, and it's the same with the assessment of embodied carbon. So, Mr. Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker, forgive me, when the government says that it wants to consult on its approach on measurement and reduction on embodied carbon, you may be beginning to wonder who else is there that it is intending to consult. The sooner that we start this process, the sooner we can reduce our emission of 50 million tonnes of carbon every year. My bill will reduce the construction industry's carbon footprint while sending certainty to UK industry that investing in decarbonisation is economically sound. It will bring economic growth and will save the taxpayer money by standardising the decarbonisation process. The government has great ambition to decarbonise. We all support it, and they should be commended for their ambition and the many actions that the government has taken in this field already. The construction industry has the appetite, tools and skills to match this ambition. We have here a tremendous opportunity to make a significant impact on the UK's carbon emissions and ensure that the United Kingdom remains a global leader by regulating embodied carbon in construction, and I commend this bill to the House.